One great thing about democracy is that it's ritualized civil war, right? It's a civil war where we all know which day to show up, and instead of fighting, we just count noses and we decide how we're going to move on. I guess the net prediction is the rise of stablecoins ends up meaning we get lower inflation globally. Yeah, that's a new prediction for me, by the way. I hadn't thought about this until just now. I refer sometimes to the Papa John's theory of institutions. Better ingredients make better pizza. That better people make better policies, and worse people make worse policies. And so that's why getting the raw ingredients right for your society is of first order importance. That's where I think the real play is for poor country, is to decide we are going to actually actively create a great replacement, a truly great replacement, right? This term gets used as a derisive term in Europe, but I think there really are opportunities for dramatic demographic change that improves national policies in ways that are very likely to work out well in the 21st and 22nd centuries.
Today, I'm speaking with Garett Jones, professor of economics at George Mason University and author of three major works that he calls the Singapore Trilogy: Hive Mind, 10% Less Democracy, and the Culture Transplant. Now, as a Singaporean, life here can sometimes feel like the movie adaptation of Garett's books. And as in many other cases, the books are a lot more fun than the movie. He also previously worked in the US Senate and is now the chief economist at Bluechip, a stablecoin rating agency. Garett's pointed research on intelligence, immigration, and democracy might test the relationship between how we think the world works and our favorite political positions. But we should take this test seriously because in true Singaporean fashion, it is a difficult test and one that many will fail. I'm very excited to hear more about Garett's ideas and how they might have changed in the wake of AI and ever-shifting geopolitical dynamics. Welcome to Second Orders, Garett. It's good to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, plenty of ink has already been spilt and saliva sprayed on your ideas on migration. Most of it has been critiques of your reasoning and evidence. So I want to do something a bit different this time and spend more time on unpacking the forward implications of what happens if your theory is right. Can you first start by giving us a brief outline of deep roots theory and how it informs your views on migration more broadly?
Yeah, well, in the early 2000s, there were a variety of papers published by academic economists that looked at the long-run effects of migration on institutional quality, national productivity. Economists love natural experiments. We don't get to run real experiments very often in macroeconomics, like as people do in the medical sciences, but we do get to watch nature's experiments, right? And one set of evil experiments that were run over the last 5 centuries were created by the great waves of migration after 1500. And so we can check and see, like, when a lot of new people move to a place, how do things change? And it turns out that country of origin matters a lot. Places that received a lot of immigrants from Western Europe tended to be pretty successful. That is also true for people who received a lot of immigrants from East Asia, especially China. The great Chinese diaspora is part of a natural experiment. And places that received a lot of immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa tended not to do as well. So these are broad generalizations, but they're empirically strong enough, robust enough, that this led to what's now known as deep roots theory, the idea that people bring traits with them. We don't know exactly how these traits are transmitted. There's a debate about how much of this is purely cultural, how much of it might be genetic, how much it might be some complicated fusion of the two. And that's beyond current tools for testing, clearly. But the idea that what is old is new again, or that the more things change, the more they stay the same, is definitely true when it comes to migration over the course of many centuries. And so deep roots theory is basically a set of glib generalizations that are spurred by the research of people like Lewis Putterman and David Wylot Brown and William Easterly, who's, if I recall correctly, now at NYU.
If we just examine one dimension of a culture, and maybe the literature covers this, so let me know if this has already been addressed. But I'm interested in the idea of the ideal migrant, because I think one of the implications of deep roots theory is that there must be this archetype, at the very least, of an ideal migrant. But even at a conceptual level, is it feasible to conceive of a coherent ideal migrant if you consider the multiplicity of problems that a country at any one time has and the accompanying multiplicity of possible solutions in terms of its human capital that could address those problems. So, for example, and this is a deliberately crude one, but bear with me. If a country has an excessively low savings rate, then getting migrants from a frugal culture would probably improve the country. And the converse would be true, right? If you have a high savings rate, then you probably want people who come from a more spendthrift culture. The difficulty to me seems to be that if at the one hand, for example, a country needs people from a more frugal culture, but in another aspect of either their social fabric or the way they do trade or conduct business domestically, they need people who are a bit more willing to spend money, then on that dimension, there would be a net detriment to that country. So must there first be a weighing by a country of like, okay, these are all the problems that we have. Some of them are more important than others. That is complex enough as a static example. But the thing is that it's really dynamic, right? And that is probably very trite to say, but it's probably worth remembering that people and a country's, their problems and the traits that they bring to the table in terms by way of solutions, those change over time as well. So how do we conceive of the ideal migrant?
Well, let me push back on your initial example there. When it comes to savings, I think just more is better. Just frugality is better. I think and this is partly because I and most macroeconomists focus a lot on the long run. And in the long run, there really is no paradox of thrift where savings can maybe make you poor because people don't consume enough. In the long run, which is where we should keep our focus 90+% of the time, higher rates of frugality are going to be associated with higher rates of patience, more foresight, a better ability to predict the future. And these are all skills that you want more of. No country ruined itself by saving too much. So on that particular trait, I'll push back. I just wanted to stand up for Team Macroeconomics and Team Frank Ramsey, who is the great economist who taught us this idea about a century ago. But the general point is very sound, right? Which is that there are a lot of different things you want, and there might be some trade-offs between them. This is, if we think of immigration policy as a way of a nation hiring new citizens, and we think of the government's immigration department as basically being a huge HR department trying to decide who to hire, it's hard to hire, right? It's hard to decide whom to hire. Anyone who hires knows that it's just a total crapshoot whether the person is going to turn out the way you think they will or not. But the fortunate thing is that all the good traits are positively correlated. The psychologists refer to this as a G factor or a first principle component. People who are smarter tend to be more patient. They tend to be more cosmopolitan. They tend to be more liberal in their attitudes, including being more generally pro-market, at least pro-trade. So a lot of these good things correlate together. So at least at a weak positive level, sometimes a strong positive level, if you just selected on IQ or if you just selected on thrift at the individual level or the national level, you would do pretty well because a lot of other good things would come along with it. I do think we should be Hayekian enough to say we don't know exactly what we need and there's a lot of unknowability in any social process. But one thing we do know is that smarter people with more pro-market attitudes on average tend to make the world better than people who are the opposite. And I don't think that the needs change much over time. And part of the reason we can tell that the needs don't change much over time is that if you look at the global rankings across countries for the last, say, century or so, things haven't changed that much, right? And the big changes have been when, communist or dirigiste economies became more laissez-faire. That's been the big change, was basically a bunch of people waking up and saying, oh yeah, all this central planning was a disaster, and then institutionally deciding with mostly the same people there that they were going to become more laissez-faire, more Friedmanite in their economics. I'd say that's been the big rank order change across time. It's not that, high trust societies turned out to be too fragile in a world of, say, advanced internet technology that made it easy to prey upon people's trustworthiness, right? Weird tricks like that haven't happened. This strange fact of persistence is the fact to explain and the fact to build upon when thinking about immigration policy.
And is it just the cultures that persist, or both the culture and, as you mentioned, the environment and what kinds of traits the environment selects for also remains persistent?
I mean, the way that most economists would put it, who haven't fully bought into deep roots theory, is they say institutions are persistent, right? And the rules of the game, government quality, legal system quality, these things tend to persist a lot from generation to generation. Part of where I take this is I build upon the deep roots theory and the associated term, which I call cultural transplant theory, and say, like, let's figure out where these institutions come from. And a lot of that does come from a question of the ingredient story. Who shows up? Who do you have in your culture? When you change the people, you usually do change the policies, and to a substantial degree. I guess the most direct answer there is, in general, uh, as long as the people aren't changing too much, there's going to be a lot of institutional persistence with these unusual once or twice a century big shocks, like the wonderful effects of the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Where a bunch of people who
Mm.
bought into the wrong model, made a good faith effort to try to build onto a better model. So there are some non-deep roots, non-culture transplant elements of institutional quality. And fortunately, in the last, 50 years, they've been people awakening to realize their institutions are worse than improving them. I assume it could go the other way.
Mm.
We worry a lot about whether the egalitarianism of the West could end up, planting the seeds of its own destruction, right? This is sort of the story where Joe Henrich's weirdest people in the world stuff is a story where people say maybe a lot of people who are critics of Western decadence say, well, maybe the institutions of the West end up planting the seeds of their own destruction. Their egalitarianism is now going to undermine itself. So that could be a case where ingredients that worked well for a couple of centuries could end up becoming dysfunctional. So that's actually to your point. Uh, some people argue that the values of East Asia and its Singaporean diaspora could end up having some robustness that Western Europe doesn't have, right? That Western European egalitarianism and individualism could end up being the wrong ingredients for the 21st and 22nd centuries.
Mm. Although there's a slight shift there, right? Because if on the one hand we're talking about the persistence of institutions, it is one thing to say that an institution is persistent because of ABC qualities or traits that the people who populate those institutions and expand and operate them have. And another thing to say that those cultural traits are themselves persistent. So is the institution persistent by way of the persistence of the cultural traits that compose the institutions?
I think it's overwhelmingly the former. Yes, there's a pizza chain in the United States known as Papa John's, and their slogan is "Better ingredients make better pizza." And I refer to what I refer sometimes to the Papa John's theory of institutions. Better ingredients make better pizza. That better people make better policies, and worse people make worse policies. And so that's why getting the raw ingredients right for your society is a first order importance. And, I think that things like intelligence and frugality, pro market attitudes are those ingredients that will tend to build better institutions. I'm open to the idea that there could be some pathological feedback mechanisms there, but that if so, they're rare, and they're rare enough that we should keep our eye on the main ball, which is, um, you know, traits like intelligence, frugality, and pro market attitudes.
If better ingredients make better pizzas, is there any world in which better pizzas in turn end up making better ingredients? Because sure, we can make the causal link between people
hmm
slash cultural traits and institutional quality, the primary focus of the chain of causation here. That is, it is from people to institutions. But on what time horizon and under what circumstances would you say that the feedback loop between institutions and people in that direction is stronger?
I don't know if the second reverse causation is stronger there, but it's at least important, right? And the big example
Mm.
would be things like education and health, right? If you've got good institutions, then even people who come from cultures where education and health systems are really weak, they reap all the benefits of this, right? So if
Mm.
when Western Europe gets a lot of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, these are folks who come from societies that have very poor educational systems, very poor health systems on average. And, what do they get? They and their descendants get better education and better health. And so they end up being healthier, more productive members of society. If you're not fighting a bunch of intestinal diseases all the time, you're going to be a more productive worker. If you have an
Mm.
educational system where the teachers show up, where the teachers haven't sold their books in order to make money on the side, you're going to get a better education. And so that shows up to very important degree, right? So good institutions are good for everyone. They do a good job lifting folks who would have wound up in the bottom of their own societies up closer toward the middle. And that's a big benefit, right? The modern rich countries are good at creating widespread human flourishing, at devoting resources to those who are difficult cases and helping to improve their situation. The old glib answer was something as simple as eyeglasses, right? There might be some people who just couldn't read easily if it weren't for eyeglasses, and eyeglasses are basically free in rich countries, right?
So I want to pick up this discussion on institutions at later points in the conversation, but don't want to spend too much time on it here. So just to return to this idea of the ideal migrant or the perfect migrant. One of my bad habits is relating evolutionary theory to everything. So
No, I'm a
how
big fan of
sympathetic
that.
are
So
you?
yeah. If there's one thing that we've learned in the last century and a half, we've learned that two great ideas in the last century and a half. We figured out evolutionary theory, and we figured out there was something beyond Newtonian physics, right? Those are the two big
Mm,
additions. So yeah,
mm.
go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'll take your word for it. Makes
Yeah.
me feel better. How sympathetic are you to the parallel between evolutionary theory and deep root theory here? And the specific parallel I'm looking at is if we consider that naturally occurring mutations are critical for having a large enough sample size for the better mutation or the mutation that is more adaptive to the environment to be found, discovered, and then to achieve victory over all the other mutations. If that is a critical piece of the puzzle, and I think it is, then wouldn't you say that narrowly or preemptively saying we are getting only migrants of a certain type from a certain place or certain parts of the world disqualifies us from getting access to that specific trait of migrant, that specific cultural trait which a migrant might have, because in 10 years ago, this wasn't a problem that we were facing. And so we allocated more resources to getting migrants from other countries. And now that the environment changes or something changes, either like ecologically, if you're stretching the analogy here, ecologically, there is some imbalance or there's some black swan external event that changes the environment. Now we are ill-prepared in terms of human capital to deal with this problem. Does this parallel make sense to you, A, and B, does it present any problems for deep roots theory?
Well, it's a reasonable question, right? I guess the first response would again be coming back to this idea that there's a first principle component that the good things are all correlated with IQ, for instance, or something very closely correlated with IQ. And so here's the way I'll put it. Something that I learned from psychologists. If you can find a positive trait that is negatively correlated with intelligence, and you can publish that in a journal, you will instantly become a famous psychologist. So, I mean, and every decade or so, I'll run into a famous psychologist and I'll ask them, is this still true? Like if I find some great cognitive trait or maybe even a non-cognitive trait that's negatively correlated with the IQ, would that make you a famous psychologist overnight? And the answer is always yes. So the idea of there being a systematic relationship, even a weak negative correlation between, say, intelligence. So the idea that there's a negative correlation between the thing you're selecting on and the thing you really want is like a theoretical possibility, but it seems rare enough that there's no reason to sweat it. I think the more important thing is there are plenty of ways to have a diversified immigration population that don't require saying, hey, maybe we should be negatively selecting on intelligence. So to that, I would just say, like, this is why being open to immigrants from a lot of different countries is a good idea. For instance, that's one way to get a valuable form of diversity. Yeah, so I think that's my colleague, Jonathan Schultz, who's here at George Mason in my department, excellent researcher. He published a paper that kind of reinforced things that other people had found, which is that the great migration that America experienced in the late 1800s, where a lot of European migrants from various parts of Europe, moved to the U.S. He found evidence that that form of diversity, which was, now well over a century ago, that injection of diversity improved innovation. And it looked like it was diversity per se, not just more bodies showing up. So he uses simple indexes of basically immigrant migration, what country of origin stuff. And it turns out that those indexes from well over a century ago predict innovation, patenting, whatever like R&D type stuff you're looking for, well over a century later. And so if I have to say, like, what's one thing that's worth trying to break up when you can is basically raw ethnic homogeneity if your goal is innovation, right? Because little cartels, little clubs need a little competition. There's one thing that economists are fans of is competition, and we worry too much about monopolistic monopolies, right? And ethnic monopolies can end up becoming ideological strongholds, monocultures. And Bringing in enough competition in the world of ideas or culture is probably a net win-win for society as a whole. Frictions in the short run, those can turn into a lot of dramatic novels that people worry about, like, oh, the Italians and the Irish, how are they ever going to get along? And I'm sure there's versions of this in Singapore that I'd be glad to let you talk about. But those conflicts are very likely worth it. I'll go more beyond probably, because cross-fertilization is really important. And I'd say, like, that's one element of your evolutionary analogy that I could bring this back to, which is that hybrid vigor is really true, is a pretty strong result in evolutionary theory, right? That hybrids you can avoid deleterious mutations, recessive deleterious mutations popping up in the population enough if you just bring in more diversity into the population. So that's one form of increased diversity. It's probably a win for innovation. And since I'm a big fan of trying to boost the level of innovation in the world, I put a premium on that, even at the cost of some short run conflict.
I want to move on to how, in practice, states respond to deep roots theory. And this is something that I've heard you, at least on one other occasion, say that further work has to be done on this. We might not have enough case studies. So I'm just wondering if anything has changed on that front. But if we think about these states which are deliberate migrant exporters, for example, like the Philippines, Bangladesh,
Yeah.
Nepal, etc., and even like involuntary net migrant exporters, right? Like just countries that people are fleeing from, or like conflict-stricken places with refugees. How are these states likely to react? Because if a state knows that, for example, it's high value per deep roots theory, do we see them start using their diaspora as like instruments of influence? And conversely, how do these migrant exporters who are like bleeding talent or bleeding human capital in that sense, how would they respond if in turn they knew that other high value states were trying to like get their people?
Okay, so let me break that into a few little pieces there. So the first angle is, are countries with high value migrants likely to be able to pull off using them as instruments of influence when they move to the new culture? And I think the answer to that is basically generally not, right? I think that countries are always going to try to spy, right? They're always going to try to manipulate things. They try, right? But, we should keep in mind that most of the stuff just doesn't work. Like, you end up paying a lot of money for intelligence services and they tell you things you can read in the New York Times. Every once in a while, I get to meet someone has a fairly high security clearance, and they're often very excited to read a new book that was just published. And if someone who has the access to the greatest secrets of the most powerful nation in the world still thinks, oh, I should go read this New York Times bestseller, that tells you that there just aren't that many secrets worth knowing, right? So that's one take on this. That's stage one. Stage two is, to what extent is a country going to be able to control its migrants a generation or two down the road? There's always a possibility of that, but that'll be a weak effect, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we every generation we've heard about migrants in the U.S. At least in my lifetime. You're worried about whether Russian scientists who come to the U.S. will take information back to the old USSR, right? You worry about that. You worry now in the U.S. about whether Chinese diaspora scientists who come to the U.S. will end up bringing information back to China. And I guess you're supposed to worry about that, but there's so much information flowing around that I think that's very much a second order concern. And people assimilate, links weaken. If you're really worried about this, then you should give these folks citizenship more quickly rather than putting them on green cards or other temporary visas where there's always a pull back to the home country. So I think a green card or citizenship solves a lot of problems because it's a clear way because people actually like to say have US citizenship or Singaporean citizenship or Japanese citizenship. And once you have that as an anchor, the pull of the home country is much, much weaker. I know there are complicated situations with families, but I'll say that family ties probably weaken quite quickly once you have a new home. So that's sort of indirect influence story, I think, is high status to talk about and of low importance in practice. But the second angle, the Filipino story, like, how should you worry about people leaving? I mean, this is just another version of brain drain, right?
I think the classic idea of brain drain is most commonly understood as an interplay between the home country and its people who are becoming migrants out of that home country. I think here what's different is that it's not so much my home country is not so good and there are better countries out there. I, as a person of my home country, is gonna, uproot myself and move somewhere else. Instead of that scenario, what we're seeing here is if deep roots theory becomes a consensus and
Uh-huh.
everyone knows, all right, there is this globally, there is this spoken or unspoken hierarchy that determines which types of migrants and by extension, which countries produce high quality migrants as per deep roots theory. How would this knowledge, this new social fact, influence the immigration market or immigration economies that we see play out in the world today? Does it mean
Okay.
that, for example, if I come from a high value deep roots nation, I should be able to be more selective about the countries that I go to, because now maybe the countries are competing for my residency, as opposed to in the current paradigm where it seems like it's a lot of people competing to get into the US? Does that dynamic shift in that way?
Yeah, I mean, thing is, so there already is a competition for high-skilled migrants by conventional measures, right? And so what deep roots or culture transplant theory adds to this is saying, hey, country of origin is its own superpower. It's its own predictive value, above and beyond whether an individual migrant has, a high IQ or good skills or an engineering degree from a fancy school. So the two are going to be correlated a lot, right? So here's the story I often suggest to people is I say, like, my hunch is, I've never done this quantitatively, but my hunch is that the optimal immigration policy is going to look something like a point system where 2/3 of the weight goes on individual traits and 1/3 of the weight goes on country of origin traits, right? And
Mm.
so, and that's, I think, probably the optimal level of integrating deep roots theory into immigration policy. And if rich countries, and that would especially be true for rich countries, I think for poorer countries, the poorer the country gets, the more they should place the weight on the deep roots measures and less on individual measures. And it, if it were true, I think the rich countries have already sort of figured this out tacitly. So for me, the big lesson is that the poor countries should be taking advantage of these ideas. They should be saying,
Mm.
I mean, if Madagascar could decided that deep roots theory was really important as a path to getting richer, they would say we would take just about anybody from China, and as long as they agree to come here, have some kids here, and plant down their own deep roots and stay for a few generations, right? And the reason I picked China is because it's
Mm.
got 1 billion people, and a lot of them aren't too rich right now, right?
Mm.
It's the poor countries that could benefit most from taking deep roots theory seriously. They should say, like, we should be subsidizing or giving preferred tax status or whatever you want to call it to try to bring in folks from countries with higher deep root scores than us in order to improve our institutions 10, 20, well, not even 10, 20, 40, 60 years from now. That's where I think the real play is for
Mm.
immigration policy, is for poor countries to decide we are going to actually actively create a culture transplant, create a great migration, create a great replacement, a truly great replacement. Right? This term gets used as a derisive term in Europe, but I think there really are opportunities for dramatic demographic change that improves national policies in ways that are very likely to work out well in the 21st and 22nd centuries.
Mm.
I don't think people will do it because I think bigotry, ethnic rivalry, and people's just intransigence, people's unwillingness to try new things are going to get in the way of this. But it's obviously possible to pull this off.
The chief reason I see this not working is, to me, I think that it's the cruel paradox of deep roots theory, and why some people might feel like it smells a bit reactionary is
Uh,
because it seems dead on arrival for poorer states, or states that are just not as well advantaged as others in the current paradigm. Because if you're a poor state and you need someone from a deep roots, high value country, there's very little you can do to incentivize that particular individual. Or maybe there's something you can do to incentivize that particular individual, but there's very little you can do at scale because you are poor in
mhm.
the first place, right? And then there's very little to, maybe you have some beaches, but
You don't
besides
have
that,
much to offer. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
it does leave us with countries that are doing well, getting people from good countries, and countries that are not doing well, not being able to get those countries, and then those seem to be self-perpetuating extreme ends that never converge again.
Yeah, my one push for this I mentioned in Culture Transplant is the excellent book China's Second Continent, which is written by a New York Times reporter who traveled. He had strong ties in China and in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's apparently about 1 million migrants who are living in sub-Saharan Africa now, and
Mm.
they have both in Some of it is elite stuff like, oh, we're building dams or electric programs or whatever. But a lot of it is just people who are building like little small manufacturing plants, running little shops out of the way, running a restaurant, a nightclub in some medium-sized town. And that is something that in principle, it might be, you're right that it would be difficult to scale it up because how would you go from 1 million to 10 million to 50 million? And one question is, many countries have a little bit of leeway with institutional change. A lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, have gotten their act together on monetary policy, and they've had very good low inflation experiences over the last decades compared to the past. So there is some room for institutional reform if you make it a focal point. And if one made a focal point commitment to say if Madagascar said, "If we can get 10 million folks to come in here from China over the next 20 years, we're going to credibly promise not to expropriate them if they get rich," right? Something like that. They might be able to pull something off like that. I'm more than half hoping that some philanthropist, perhaps some philanthropist made rich by the IPOs of the great AI firms, will decide that they want to create a new project of subsidizing immigration from China to one or two countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And I am very confident that that is likely would turn out well 50 years from now, and people would look back on that and say that was a world transforming and a world improving change.
A seemingly trivial thing, right? But I feel like it has the potential to be quite influential on how immigration markets change in the future. And this might seem like a highly contrived way of bringing in AI, but I just thought of this, and it seems like one of the primary contributions of agentic AI is that it can make communication between any two human entities much more efficient, and it can do so even if neither or only one of the entities are actually like present in that interaction. So it can communicate on a human's behalf, essentially. If this, say, we leave the technical complications of that aside, and we say it's a widespread technology, every human has its AI agent, clone, twin, then do we see a possibility of, in the immigration process, people negotiating directly with the customs or immigrations departments or agencies of other countries for the particular terms of their migration? So that if you are from a high value country, then perhaps as part of that negotiation, you are allowed a little more leverage on the terms of your relocation, as opposed to someone else who's from a lower value deep roots country. Does communication at scale converge with deep roots theory to create possibly a new kind of immigration market?
Well, I mean, one question is there any information beyond the basic 3 or 4 facts of deep roots theory, right? So like when I've suggested what tools would I use for implementing my ideas, I mean, I actually haven't recommended using the deep roots measures themselves, which would be fine. But I always say like, maybe we use a 3-value index of your country's national average test scores, your national average savings rate, and your national average level of corruption, the inverse of that. And the question is like, could a fancy AI come up with something vastly better than that? I really don't think so, right? This is a case where these 3 things have a pretty high R squared, a pretty high correlation with, they're correlated with each other, and they're correlated with all the good things that you could actually measure. Everything else beyond that is kind of noise. So
So
I
you're
think
saying
there's a reason.
there's very little else to negotiate about.
Yeah, there's not much more to add because everything beyond that is sort of chit chat and bullshit, right? I mean, there's a reason why a lot of legal contracts are written in with clear dividing lines. There's a reason why bankruptcy is defined in a clear way. Like you miss a payment, you're bankrupt, right? And these simple enforceable rules are welcome to both sides of the transactions ex ante, right? Because you want systems that are easy to enforce ex post and that have clear dividing lines. Human beings love a drama. We love nuance. Our brains are wired for it. But when we say, how do we want to live on a day-to-day basis? We want to just say like, you broke the rule in a really clear way. We're not going to worry about the nuance here. And I think partly it's because there just isn't that much information. And partly it's because I guess the most pro AI critique of what I just said is that the information processing costs are too high to deal with all the detail and the nuance. And maybe AI shrinks that possibility. Makes it a lot easier to handle those complicated cases and to negotiate over them. I have strong doubts, more than just some doubts, strong doubts about whether basically AI created legal systems that can negotiate at high speed and pulling in vast amounts of information. I have strong doubts about whether they'll come up with legal settlement questions more broadly that are very different from the ones we already have. And if that's true more generally, I'm just applying
Mm,
this as a particular case study. Part of my story is that when you're bringing in a migrant, you're bringing in their descendants too. And there's going to be
mm,
so much diversity among the descendants, right? Things like children and grandchildren are very different from the parents in some ways. The apple doesn't fall that far from the tree on the basic levels of, say, intelligence or hard work or whatever. These things are kind of heritable genetically and perhaps culturally too. But there's so much diversity about all the little details, which is sort of where you've pushed the discussion here, right? Like, do I want somebody who's more of an engineering person or more of a literary person, right? Do I want someone who's warm and cuddly or bureaucratic? Those are things that you can't select for beyond the first generation to any
mm.
material sense. And the deep root stuff is about picking picking the migrant now whose children and grandchildren are going to help make your country great.
Here's why I asked it. Your migration ideas, I think in general, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they sit in the lineage of those arguments or those models of the world in which when you go down the abstraction ladder and you become more concrete, then you start to see how just one layer of concreteness below negates or undermines the point or the assumptions that you had in the previous layer of abstraction. So D-Roots would, for example, be saying, it's not just migrants from anywhere, it's migrants from countries with these specific cultural values or these like G factors. And on the other hand, I see one of the benefits of generally like communication technologies, but AI in particular, being in the specificity with which human interactions and activities can be performed. That is, to put it in other words, our increasingly weaker reliance on general purpose technologies and general purpose rules and standards by extension, and being able to have everything customized. Like one incarnation of that is social media and the algorithmic feed, in that everyone
Mhm.
has their own bespoke set of information streams. And if these two things meet, then it could mean something very interesting for the development of new human activities and also markets. So in this case, to be more specific, it would be AI would enable assessments at an individual level to be possible. And what your argument or what Deep Roots theory shows is that if you get more specific and more detailed, more nuanced, you get better outcomes because you are better able to triangulate the relative value of one migrant as opposed to another. So if you take these two things, they're both saying specificity is better and specificity is possible, which only encourages me to extrapolate that to the extreme end and say, well, what if all immigration applications could be personally given like 100% scrutiny and attention by
Mhm.
an AI? Wouldn't you then undermine the idea of D-Roots theory? Because then there's no such thing. Now, we don't have to use IQ as a proxy anymore. We don't have to use any of these cultural traits as a proxy. We could use them as frameworks, benchmarks against which the AI will assess an applicant. But for all descriptive, non-normative matters, the AI can elicit all this information directly from an applicant and doesn't have to rely on proxies.
Well, yeah, remember the AI is stuck with the same knowledge problem that we all have, which is that basically people are good at faking things, and so that's part of the reason why it would rationally be skeptical of the claims in a 500-page packet, right? So, if you reframe your question as what would the AI in its dream wish to have as a complete set of information about a person, right?
Mm, mm,
Suppose there were a credible way for me to just press a key and tell the AI, you can watch the last 6 months of all of my social media feeds, of everything I've ever typed, of all of my emails, right? And let's even suppose falsely that I wouldn't have faked everything in advance in order to maximize my application chances, right?
mm,
So in that sort of utopian case, I think what's still going to happen is that it's gonna figure out there's just a few big factors that are highly predictive of success, and they're gonna look like a G factor, and they're gonna look like some cultural traits that are that are correlated with my ancestry, right? So they're gonna notice that basically maybe the people from Confucian cultures are kind of different from people from weird cultures, right? From Western Europe. There's so first factor that's going to matter a lot is going to be something like IQ. Second factor is going to be some sort of one or two broad cultural vectors. And then beyond that, there's a bunch of noise. So I think A, it
Mm,
would land on that. Second, there is the bigger problem of the fact that people fake things, right? When they know they're being evaluated, they try to rig the system. And one of the benefits of using the deep roots factors or the culture transplant measures, the ones that have been widely used in literature, is, as I've said before, you can fake your resume, but you can't fake your country's resume. And so
mm,
part of what you're worried about in any kind of immigration policy is to what extent are people just, padding things, faking things, making sure they get a disability waiver so they could take 4 hours on the test instead of the normal two. These moral hazard problems are just, universal in econ. And of course, they're universal, very important in immigration policy as they are in any high stakes decision. And
mm.
so I think that's, the simplicity, the unfakeability or the hard to fakeness of these deep roots measures are one reason why I think an AI that had a broad access to data would still place a lot of weight on the measures that you personally can't control.
Okay, I want to move on to the links between national IQ and economic performance.
Hmm.
When thinking about this and how AI plays into it, I thought of two approaches. One is that AI changes the nature of the relationship between national IQ and economic performance. And the second is that AI breaks the relationship altogether. It's a complete severance and it decouples IQ from a
Hmm.
country's economic performance. On the first way of approaching it, well, you could say that the nature of the relationship changes if you are talking about, say, like complementarity. And both complementarity and the second concept, substitution, is something that you've discussed. So I'm happy to hear more about those ideas in their original form, but also how they've developed over time. But say we take complementarity, and that means that AI automates all of the lower skill jobs while leaving the higher, more G-loaded tasks for humans to do. Does that allow higher IQ countries to pull ahead even further? And does the substitution scenario wherein expertise is still crucial in these, like what you call O-ring sectors or O-ring jobs, because they require high quality labor that a nation sometimes has to adopt, and this leads to the implications of migration that you discussed. So is it substitution or complementarity? And do you think of it as it changing the nature of the relationship between IQ and performance, or is it a complete decoupling?
Well, a core part of my Hive Mind story is that IQ matters mostly through externalities, through spillovers, right? And a big part of that, maybe half, is this institutional factor, right? And so the idea is that smarter people build better institutions, which help the whole system work better. And so one question is, will AI be allowed by humans to actually build better institutions? And so that's the one scenario that I can imagine where AI does really weaken the relationship between national IQ and national productivity would be a situation where a lot of poor countries decide we're just going to turn over our government and a lot of our management decisions for a society over to AIs, right? And we folks who don't, we're not the sharpest tools in the shed. I mean, no human is, but like we know that our test scores aren't that great. And so we're just going to outsource a lot of our governance to AIs. And in that setting, any country smart enough to do that could do that credibly, would plausibly within the next decade start seeing dramatic increases in growth. My hunch is
Mm,
that countries that basically, there'll probably be a couple of experimental middle income and poor countries that will be full AI maxers. And part of that will be handing over a lot of governance, routine bureaucratic decisions over to AIs. And countries that do that will start seeing miracles, economic miracles
mm,
that are visible to all, too obvious for anybody to ignore. And that would be a way of basically saying, like, you know, it would be an electronic way of doing what I was suggesting before, which is having the Chinese diaspora move into your country and start doing a bunch of great stuff, right?
mm,
And so AI may offer a socially acceptable possibility to this, an alternative to implement this sort of, instead of having the Chinese diaspora move to your country, you have OpenAI move to your country in a
mm,
large degree. And it can't just be like, oh, they're going to take over this little job or that little job, or we're going to have 30 AI agents running an assembly line. It has to be saying, like, we're going to handle the legal system so that people know in advance there's going to be very little corruption now. Uh, and we know that the rules of the game are going to exist for a long time, and they'll be transparent enough for real humans to understand them. And one could hope, one could hope that this sort of ethnic conflicts that have happened between humans when people of different ethnicities move to a country won't happen between humans and AIs. We already know that there's a tension between humans and AIs, but I'm open to the possibility that there's enough intellectual and cultural diversity in the world that some cultures will be like, yeah, those AIs, they're fun. Yeah, I'm
Mm,
okay having an AI be 20% of our national assembly, of our national legislature. I'm okay having it be our constitutional court, something like that. And those are the kind of situations where you can get narrowing in incomes across countries. The flip side, which you also suggested, where you could see a dramatic widening, is where that can't happen. People can't make that credible commitment to having the AI. People in poor countries can't make the credible commitment to having the AI be their form of government to a substantial degree. And in those cases, having AIs be part of these O-ring processes, these fragile, delicate production processes where getting everything right is super awesome and getting one thing wrong destroys all the value. For the audience, that's the example of the O-ring, the Space Shuttle Challenger, which was destroyed, which exploded in flight because one rubber O-ring was fragile. So you had the entire ship working well, but one little piece malfunctioning meant that everyone on the ship died, tragically. So many modern production processes are like that, right? Building computer chips is that way. Every step has to be perfect, otherwise it's worthless. You throw it away. A
mm,
lot of modern value is created through O-ring processes. It's very plausible that AI-led, AI-organized, AI-managed O-ring processes will be vastly more productive than those with humans in the loop. And if it's currently the rich countries where test scores are high that are best at managing this stuff, and if they start being able to manage those kind of delicate production processes much better, then that's where you get a scenario of 20, 30 years of the rich countries pulling away from the poor even more. So where the poor countries are basically running on 1990s technology and the rich countries are operating on science fiction tech.
mm. In which case, and this is interesting because then this could be an answer to our question of how poorer countries could attract high quality migrants. Is if poorer countries tend, for whatever reason, to be the ones that are more likely to embrace AI in governance, then that could be the incentive for several segments of the migrant population to be like, that might be a good idea. It's a good experiment at the very least, and I'll move there to try to see what life could be like.
That's actually good. That's a good point, right?
Mm,
Because yeah, you probably need some sharp people to manage that process, right? And you probably need a lot of them. I mean, we've seen over the last 3 years that demand for skilled programmers has actually risen, not fallen, right? Because they're a strong complement to AI implementation, AI improvement. We already know that there's a huge consulting industry in basically bringing AI into firms. It would be world changing if we had a similar move of bringing AI into governance. The
mm,
culture is not there for that, right? Government people are totally behind the ball on AI as a rule, right? And the exceptions to that rule are people basically in my greater orbit. The Mercatus Center has had a bunch of folks who are great in AI. Dean Ball
mm,
is a person who has helped bridge that gap in an important way between government and AI. There are 180 plus countries in the world. If 5 of the poor ones just get on board with AI maxing and bringing in the workers who would complement that as a part of bringing AI into actual day-to-day governance, I mean, that's going to be world changing in a way that would be hard for the world not to notice.
yeah, which is funny because it just made me think about how the AI took my job discourse could be then applied to these migrants, the pioneering migrants who went to a poor country to build the AI governance systems and then automated themselves out of their jobs as
Yes.
high quality migrants. Because then afterwards, if intelligence and G factors are the ones that's most deterministic about the relative economic success of a country, then as the dictator of poor country A, what I'll do is incentivize all these smart cookies to come, build the AI, and then deport them because that's essentially what I needed
Yeah.
the smart cookies for.
Fortunately, like the AI took my job is already a strong enough meme that the dictator would need to find a way to credibly tell the immigrant, we'll let you stick around. And so the question is, what sort of contracts could the dictator write in order to get the migrants to come, knowing that there is this ex post incentive for deportation? It could be massively, it could be that you just have to pay them a massive amount of money to get them to come, right?
Mm,
Or it could be that there's some kind of contract enforced in Switzerland that pays out a massive amount if they are deported, where you're basically
mm,
outsourcing that payment to a third party. So you'd have to write, the meme is already there. And if the meme is in the programmer's minds, very few of them will move without some credible promise of fair treatment ex post.
Even with say credible guarantees, there's always this information asymmetry between new country and migrant that I think is quite interesting as it pertains to deep roots theory also, because usually it's the idea of say migrant from Indonesia knows a lot about the United States, and that's partly or if not chiefly the reason why he wants to move to the US in the first place. But the US does not know enough about migrant. And so what deep root theory kind of does is it helps fill in that gaps by evening that information asymmetry. But what you're discussing here is kind of like, it's divergent in a sense in that migrant does not know in the fullness of time what would be the outcome of their transition to poorer country if it was on this particularly like idiosyncratic basis of like, I come here to help you build AI, but you must guarantee me a place afterwards. But yeah, it just seems interesting that the information asymmetry persists in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad to see that the economics of AI discourse has penetrated a fair amount of sophisticated discussions. That, you know, the new theory of the firm, the economics of organization that economists built up in the 70s and 80s, and for which there have been a bundle of Nobel Prizes, really is going to inform how AI gets integrated into normal corporate governance, and then perhaps over the next decade into actual democratic or even autocratic governance.
I want to ask how you think about the effects AI has on the place premium. And the place premium is your idea of how there are particular places that enable people to perform much better, at least economically speaking, than they otherwise would be able to if they were in some other place, or if they were more directly, if they were in their home countries. So could surrounding a worker in Lagos with like several AIs that replicate exactly the intellectual environment of San Francisco, for example, enable that worker to make as much as he would have if he had physically moved to SF? And if not, what does it say about the relative importance of cognition versus institutions?
Yeah, this goes back to the Hive Mind story, right? Which is that it's the externalities of intelligence that really matter a lot. And the core externalities are what we normally call institutions. Smarter people tend to build better institutions. But beyond that, in the old literature, there was always this blurry distinction between institutions and culture. And I think that it's time to bring back that blurriness. And I think part of the value of being around smart people is partly, they build better government in this formal, juridical way. And there's also that they build a better cognitive culture. So this is a case where, I'm a big fan of the philosopher Jim Flynn, the late philosopher who documented what we now call the Flynn effect, the idea that intelligence has been rising over time. And but he didn't just document that. He also had a theory of intelligence, which is basically, he says that over the course of the 20th century, what happened is that life in the rich countries became more like an IQ test. It became more about looking for general principles, looking for levels of abstraction, looking at the ability to draw insights from the general and apply them to a new case, right? The old saying about intelligence is that intelligence is what you need when you don't know what you need. And Flynn argued that a good cognitive environment is part of what makes you smarter. And so to create a story where like a Lagos, where to take a place like Lagos and create the same cognitive environment that you'd have in San Francisco would involve having AIs around you sort of all the time, having them be, say, half the people you talk to. And one could create that. And then the AIs would basically be creating a San Francisco level hive mind, at least on the day-to-day thinking level. And that would obviously, I think, raise cognitive scores, test scores, IQ scores, general subjectively felt smartness in Lagos on a high level. So that's part of it, right? I think like you could actually create a cognitive culture that was at that level. Social media must be doing this to some small degree, like if everybody's watching first world, reels or the TikToks. But beyond that, so that helps some. Beyond that is like, how do you get San Francisco level governance? And part of the reason San Francisco level governance is so high is because it draws on the backstop of the American legal system. And that's part of how you get to produce a lot in Lagos. You could produce a lot in Lagos is if you had something that was approaching rich country levels of government quality, right? people are always worried, like, how am I going to get something done, right? There's a lot of links in the chain to basically building a chip fabrication facility. It's not just having the factory there, it's getting things delivered in a timely manner, not having rent seekers predate upon you at every step of the way. And so that requires a long production chain. And that means changing all of the, like to get one good thing done in Legos, you need to get a lot of good things done in Legos. And so it does become that chicken and egg problem. You would imagine, as you're probably thinking, well, this could happen for simple call center type work or laptop job type work. People should be able to outsource that. And to some extent, some of that must happen. But if we're thinking about anything beyond those sort of mundane laptop jobs where people could they could be digital nomads. When we're thinking about long production processes, it really means getting a lot of things right. And that means getting things that are at the level of what we normally call institutional change. That's what makes it hard to take on grand tasks in Legos that are at frontier levels of productivity. It's the long chains, the long production chains, the long supply chains where many things have to be done right in order to get anything done. So basically, one way to put it is that everything's an O-ring. Everything's an O-ring production process. And for the audience, this is Michael Kremer's great idea, Kremer, Nobel laureate now. The O-ring theory of economic development. Very simple model. It's worth Googling if you haven't looked it up. It's very useful for thinking about what frontier production is like. You have to get a lot of things right in order to get anything done.
Right. Basically, the idea that inputs have multiplicative effects on outputs, right?
Yes, exactly. And truly multiplicative, right? So, if you have a 99% chance of getting a process done right, well, that's great. But if you have a 99% chance of getting one step done right and there's 100 steps, wow, not very much is going to get done right. Even if it's 99% chance of success at each particular step in the process. And a lot of production processes, a lot of value creation are these long 100-step production chains where the difference between 99% and 99.9% isn't 0.9%. It's like 50, 60, 70% ultimately. Like, Kremer used the example of a good that can get sold at a store like Saks Fifth Avenue, a very famous American high-end brand, versus what gets sold at their remainder store, which is, I forget the name of that one actually. Is it Off Fifth? I think it's called Off Fifth. And so when something is a remainder, like at the smallest little flaw in a piece of high-end clothing means it gets sold for half of its price or 1/3 of its price. And with computer chips, it's even more extreme, right? And those are just a small illustration of the kind of value gaps that we see when production processes are O-ring.
So would it be fair to say that the synthesis between cognitions and institutions, insofar as your views on place premiums are concerned, are that a lot of things must be done right in order to get anything done, and that's the argument for institutions. But in order for things to be done right in the first place, you need high levels of competence and ability, and that's the argument for cognition, and this is how the two meet.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly right. People use the place premium in a lot of different ways. It's used as a general term. My story is, a lot of people's story is that most of the place premium around the world is about institutional quality. Most economists stop at that point. Where I go is I say, well, most of the institutional differences are due to human capital differences. There are other place premiums too. I mean, like San Francisco is just a nice place to be, right? It's beautiful. The weather's nice in some ways, almost all the year. I used to live across the Bay of Berkeley for a year. Pretty views are part of the place premium, but when we look across the planet, most of the place premium, in my view, is human capital externalities, human capital spillovers, being around smart people.
Say we have an AGI, ASI scenario where individual human IQ becomes economically irrelevant to production because you have on the one hand a 130 IQ person who can design a cancer-saving drug. He is able to do the exact same things that 80 IQ person could do because of AI.
Yeah.
Is there a world in which is that a world in which national IQ becomes an economically irrelevant metric or proxy for other states to use? And B, in general, will there ever be a point at which we collectively say intelligence is not so much a requirement, or it's not such a valid proxy for how good a migrant can be for a country, either because firstly there are other things that we do better at than AI at that point because we just aren't nearly clever enough, or maybe there's been some global equilibrium reached, but economic success It's not a goal for many states. And maybe this is an issue of time horizons, how far we're willing to go. But where do you sit on this?
Well, it turns a lot on this question of what the ASI ends up looking like, right? This superintelligence. But if it works sort of the way we've been discussing here, the key question is whether the people in the society are able and smart enough to credibly delegate a lot of decisions to the ASI, right? Because the ASI is basically, a god, right? That can solve many problems very quickly and give solutions and perhaps run an army of robots that can make a lot of things happen that to solve a lot of human problems. And then the core question becomes which humans are willing to delegate authority and a lot of decision making power over to the ASI, which humans aren't, right? And let's assume that still matters, right? Let's assume that people are still in a position to uh, credibly make this decision if they want to, right? In that case, what matters is are people smart enough and patient enough to let the ASI run things, knowing that there will be bumps along the road and bad things along the way? Or does their short-sightedness, does their impatience, does their anger at the machines keep them from delegating stuff to the AI, right? A lot of that's going to be correlated with intelligence, not perfectly, but at least to a high degree, I think. So patience is something that's correlated with intelligence, and foresightedness is, and I think that's something that will continue. It will continue to be important. The level of intelligence of a country will continue to be important in that kind of world, because the smarter
Mm,
groups are more likely to come together to pick the focal point and say, yes, we're going to delegate a lot of like manufacturing processes off to the AI. Yes, we're going to
mm.
delegate a lot of government decisions off to the AI. And other folks are going to be basically species centric, right? They're going to be pro human and they're going to celebrate human values and not letting these AIs run their world. And they're going to be the poorer for it.
And I think the strange thing is that the people most likely to have or to espouse those beliefs and actually enforce them probably tend to be the smarter people who, whether by way of education or just overthinking, just being trained in the bad habits of overthinking, they overly complicate the adoption and deployment process of AI governance. Whereas you could see maybe say a poorer country with much say higher rates of impulsiveness being just like, hey, let's dive headfirst and let's do this whole AI thing. We don't have to have our committees and debates and Substack blogs debating the pros and cons of this. So it could be that we see the first wave being the poorer, not so good countries, and they pull ahead because of that. Because there's just so much like waffling around and quibbling on the side of the more developed, smarter nations. Is that a
Yeah,
possibility?
I mean, that's like we hit on this earlier, right? That it's possible that poor countries have the most to gain from the right immigration policy. Poor countries have the most to gain from, or have a lot to gain, obviously, from turning over a lot of big decisions to AIs. And the question is whether they're going to be able to come together and do this, right?
Mm,
And I really hope that a few do, because I think it will very likely provide, uh, within a 5 to 10 year window, various very clear signs of success. Something as obvious as the changes that happened in Central Europe after the fall of communism, right? Within a decade, it was really clear. But between 1990 and 2000, it was clear like, wow, Poland's a lot richer than it used to be. Wow, what happened? And it's kind of obvious. Um,
mm.
and I think a similarly rapid, obvious set of changes would be clear if some poor countries could credibly hand over some authority to the AIs. I think the credibility problem is hard, right? But
Mm,
the fact that poor countries have done a pretty good job with central bank independence over the last decade and letting countries like not getting into these terrible traps of heavily politicized lending and whatnot, the fact that they've improved that is a sign that there's a good chance of this happening for AI-led governance as well. It's speculative, obviously, but the improvement of poor countries and monetary policy is a big example of delegating authority to a bunch of nerds, right? And just letting
mm,
them decide, like, here's what's going to happen on really important
mm.
financial decisions. And the fact that many poor countries did that is a hopeful sign that they might do the same thing with AI governance.
Okay, this is good. I see the segue into 10% less democracy there. But just before that, I think the point I actually wanted to make was a different one. It seems like when you were discussing how important it is to to be intelligent, or at least have the traits positively correlated with intelligence in an ASI world, we were focusing on that part of the timeline where we were transitioning into an AI society or ASI society, in that we must make key decisions that will have lasting and enduring effects on how the nation is administered. We must make key decisions on which parts of the government to deploy AI and how to do so, and which stakeholders to work with, etc. It seems like that this is true, and this is true during the transitionary period. But if we take a stable post-ASI period, do you see a possibility in which, because all these things have been settled, right? Say, whatever the optimal amount of government that should be done by AI is already being done by AI, and likewise for the private sector. In that environment, do we see human IQ being obliterated as a relevant factor in terms of economic success and performance altogether?
Across countries, basically, that there's much less inequality across countries. That's a possibility if human beings within regional geographies can still keep up that commitment to delegating things to the AI. That's the key question. Is like you're sort of assuming the answer when you say, like, suppose we're in a post-ASI future and we solved all these problems. Like, that's the big questions. Can we solve these problems? The rich country version of this, on a small, almost comical, tragically comical note, is watching what's happening with Waymos right now, right? With robot-driven cars. And the cliche is that in the United States, that Republican states get Waymos and Democratic states get studies. So the desire to sort of protect Uber driver jobs is strong enough that it beats out the desire to save lives from car crashes, right? And that's a really big decision, right? And it's important for people's lives. And yet there are a whole bunch of places that are getting it wrong, and they may get it wrong for 10 or 20 years, maybe forever. I don't know. Rhode Island just passed a law, apparently. I don't know if it became enacted or if it's just being debated, to require that a third of all grocery checkout counters be run by humans, right? So there is the pushback against handing decisions over to these robots is going to remain with us for a long time. And, if the difference between ASI governance and human governance is 10x or 100x, then even small carve-outs for humans could be very socially costly. And so that's what I'd want to think about, is basically, can societies credibly commit to these, to ASI governance on stuff, right? Like, we could imagine a world where a century ago people said, even less than that, saying, I don't trust computers to decide whether to clear my checks. I want a human being looking at my check and making sure that I actually wrote it out for $1,700 or $2.50 or whatever it was. I need humans to check this. This is super important. And, if we lived in that world, that would be we'd be living in a different financial world than we did now. And you could imagine some states, some places and times saying, we need the equivalent of human inspected check clearing. We need human driven cars. We need human handled governance. And if this truly is an O-ring process, if there's 100 steps that are being done by the AI almost perfectly, but we're still requiring one step to be done by a human, in an O-ring sense, this can be incredibly socially costly. So if the differences across societies, even if the differences across societies shrink from the point of view of us as people today looking out saying, well, wow, gosh, you're all living as, being governed by robot gods. So who cares whether the robot god is handling 70% of your life or 99% of your life? In an O-ring sense, that could be a 10x, a 20x, a 500x difference in quality of life. Yeah, the AI carve-outs, whether they're intentional or sort of unintentionally chosen, could end up having massive consequences for the wealth of nations. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. AI and democracy. Do you have a working model of how democracies evolve and where exactly in this evolution technology plays a role? And can you extrapolate this to account for how widespread adoption of AI would change democracies?
Well, we already know that everybody in government is using AI all the time because they're just people and everyone's using them all the time, right? So, my guess is in the US, my guess is, half the members are checking it all the time, maybe 2/3, 3/4, right? They're, what's this bill about that I'm voting on? Whatever, that kind of stuff. So they're already using AI a lot, but at the same time, their jobs depend on getting reelected, right? We're running, we're representative democracy, and in representative democracies, the vibes of the people are really powerful. And those vibes are not going to change very much anytime soon. So we're now at the point where we know that lawyers are using AI all the time to submit their briefs. That's probably going to raise the standards of the median brief, even though some people are still falling for hallucinations, right? So the quality of certain kinds of technical work will increase. Levels of raw human understanding could go up or down, right? Basically, based on the substitution versus complement angle. And I don't have a good answer to that right now. So the quality of inputs gets higher, but at the crucial decision point, people may get lazier, right? Because they're outsourcing a lot of thinking to the AI. And on net, under the current regime, I think that still improves governance because people will use AI as a tool to help them improve their jobs, and the way they, from the point of view of elected politicians, the way they get to improve their jobs, a better job, they're doing their job better if they're getting reelected at a higher rate, right? And improving some other ex post benefits like keeping up relations with lobbyists who could give them jobs later. So AI improves governance quality on net right now, even with the lazy substitution that occurs along the way, I think. Question is, can we, you know, at what point will we start formalizing the role of AIs rather than just having everybody secretly holding it underneath their, underneath the desk during the meeting, right, to check it out? Or integrating it into their AI, integrating it into their laptop by using the software I will still not mention so they can improve their live chats. So formalizing the role will be the big step, right? Deciding that one or two or three of your Supreme Court justices are going to be AIs, that's going to be the big step. That's real outsourcing. And my guess is, based on past experience, I guess you would guess that people won't do it that nakedly, right? I would guess that it's a little too obvious, a little too on the nose to just say we have two Supreme Court justices who are now AIs. So they'll have to find a backdoor way to integrate AI into democratic governance. So I don't know what those institutions will be right now. But one good news for AI and democracy is that so far, at least, AI, there's one experimental study showing this, showing that AI seems to reduce belief in conspiracy theories. If everybody's checking their AI for stuff to see what they believe, it probably will reduce belief in some of the most extreme conspiracy theories, which is good news for the inputs for voter quality. I think that's one case where, without assuming broad institutional change, we probably get better governance over the next 10 years, as more and more people are checking their AIs all the time to say, should I really believe this screenshot that Elon Musk just retweeted? That probably improves the quality of discourse right there.
What about short time horizons? Because that seems to be a important factor that you consider in considering the wide array of political failures or ways that you can fail politically, and how insulation is the remedy for the problems brought by short-term horizons. So does AI change things when it comes to a technocrat or a state functionary's time horizons? And does it change things when it comes to a voter's, the electorate's time horizon?
My immediate response is no, because that's an institutional change question, right? Because the way you get the benefits of long terms is by delegating big decisions to some independent org, right? And that's what my colleague Jim Buchanan would probably call a constitution level decision. It's a big political change to decide we're going to go from 2-year terms to 4-year terms. And voters' demand for responsiveness from their political systems is pretty strong. And their willingness to delegate to distant bureaucracies is constrained, limited, idiosyncratic. So I think AIs could in principle do better, right? I think in principle, AIs are good at reminding you about, like, here's the long-term consequences of this short-term impulse that you have. But how do you get modern representative democracies writ large, like big tent version of representative democracies? How do you get these guys to embrace the long-term thinking that an AI and that nerds like me are in favor of? That's an institution quality decision. That probably takes a decade of persuasion, unless one sees that, say, one or two countries have a huge success with AI governance, and then other countries just feel like they have to keep up with it just to compete. That force of competition, that force of an example, can get people to change on autonomous, not quite endogenously. And you can get endogenous change from the success of a competitor. That's sluggish, clunky, imperfect, but it would happen. So if Denmark, if a smart country like Denmark, makes a decision to just outsource a couple of bureaucracies to AI and gets really big, obvious, beneficial results clearly and quickly, then other people start feeling like they have to imitate it. Otherwise, I don't think we get that long run thinking just from AI per se.
At risk of beating a dead horse, to return to the idea of AI as the chief communications technology or the last incarnation of communication technologies that we might need, maybe not last, I think telepathy would be cool. Do you see a future in which we have a lot more ballot boxes for a lot more issues, and that changes time horizons indirectly by allowing, in America, it's like the primaries, or in other parliamentary democracies, the general elections to be focused on really like the merits and ideas of the individual, as opposed to be like a issue driven election, because there is no need to campaign on issues because issues can be voted on individually. You don't have to vote in proxies of an individual or a party. Every resident or every voter can just like submit their personal preference for a particular issue. And if that's the case, then that might change the way campaigns are run, firstly, and how campaigns are perceived.
Oh, so this is a story where AI reduces transaction costs for democratic input. And so people sort of they disintermediate, right? They say like, okay, I don't need you to make the decision. We'll just have a bunch of votes on things and we can run it so quickly and cheaply that we'll do it all the time. This is something that's been possible for decades, right? People were wondering if the internet by itself would lead to big increases in plebiscitary type decisions. And while I haven't tested this or even know of other people who've tested it, I don't think it's really happened, right? So that
What do you think?
transaction cost, maybe people just don't care enough, or maybe people like quietly believe that it's good to let the government just run on its own for every once in a while. I mean, I think one version of it could be that people are sophisticated enough to think, sure, I'd like more input every day into my government, but I don't want all these other clowns to have input into government every day. And so it's the other people that I'm worried about. I don't know if people are sophisticated enough to be thinking, or I mean, they could be, but they have that potential. But that's noteworthy that it hasn't happened over the last 30 years. The rise of the internet made it easy to do all this, and yet we haven't done it. And so I think that's my default point is that if we already got a big shock that should do the thing you said, even getting a bigger shock isn't going to change it much.
Yeah, the fact that the means for very specific, concrete voter action and the entire system it can engender from there. The fact that this technology has existed for very long and we haven't done anything with it in that direction yet probably shows that we care about only a very few select parts of civic life, daily life, governance, and politics in general. And so the idea that the issue is with how much democracy we have in the system might be misguided, because it's not about the extent to which a particular system or government to citizen interaction is democratic, but more about whether or not the electorate cares about the issue at all in the first place. And if it is not something they care about, then we see rates of participation plummet. There's a very extreme like power law going on here. Does that seem to you to be a threat to the idea behind 10% less democracy?
Well, people, one way to put it is that people are a lot more interested in keeping track of sports than they are in keeping track of politics. So, like, if you just look around at least in the rich countries, there are a lot more sports fans who can tell you about the names of different team members than there are people who could keep track of a similar number of politicians. It's like the people like, you and me who like keeping track of politics. We're the weirdos, right? So people like checking in on their government every once in a while. They keep track of like this or that big scandal or whatever, maybe. But by and large, their lives, it's not just that their lives are busy, it's that there are other fun things to think about for most people. Like there are just a lot of things to think about. And so the level of checks and balances that we have in the rich democracies, we have like a pretty good level of voter participation, and voters are demanding a lot more. And that's worth keeping in mind, right? Like part of it is that people are cognitively, the economists, the glib version is cognitively lazy, but the more sophisticated version of it is they're cognitively economizing, right? And a lot of people, I know the polls I know the data on this for the US, that basically in the US, people start really paying attention to the election about just a couple months beforehand. start reading up on the issues, keeping track. So most people aren't like you and I who just like to know all the time, like what's going on with this bill or that issue or these political coalitions. And so you don't want to demand. One doesn't want to demand too much of the voters, but B, the voters are comfortable with not having too much demand placed on them.
Mm,
And that's probably the equilibrium for quite some time. So that's why you can kind of treat that demand as the outcome we have is one wouldn't say socially optimal in any sense, but it's an equilibrium. And so therefore you can use something like the rise of AI and say, how does that change this equilibrium? And the simplest version is they'll use it to get slightly better answers to questions they were already thinking about at the
mm.
input level, right? So it's going to make our voters a little bit better informed, I think, and that's good news for us.
Does it make grammatical sense to say generally integrating AI into a system or process results in a net increase or decrease in the democraciness of the process? Does that kind of play make sense?
When I'm being precise, when I'm in precise mode, I use democracy to mean, the effective control of the masses over the government they live in, right? And giving them more information does give them more effective control. So that is a way in which I would say it would increase democracy. But the more important channel is that it gives them more accurate information about policy, government, whatnot. It'll make it harder for them to be fooled. And so I wouldn't say that that channel by itself makes it more democratic, but it does give them more accurate information and very likely less paranoid information about the world they live in, which will help them make better democratic decisions. So
Mm,
politicians, I mean, there'll probably be a bunch of reports over the next few years about how a bunch of academic research about how the rise of AI has or has not improved the information level of voters. And my suspicion is that it will improve their information level and it'll reduce the noise level in between the true wishes of voters, the deep wishes of voters in some sense, and government outcomes.
my final question on this issue, mm, which does AI impact more? The types and numbers of people who vote on specific things or the types of decisions that voters make? And here, maybe to be more concrete, we can split up types of decisions voters make to be either like the subject matter or domain that they vote. Say for some reason, everyone in this municipality likes to vote on, say, like plumbing issues or public drainage issues, but they don't want to vote on on economic issues. And or it could be that the types of decisions they make are in terms of whether they are binary answer, yes, no, or more open-ended. So do you see AI impacting any of these ways of practicing democracy?
I think my short answer is no. People love a delegate who represents them. I think that the idea,
Mm,
like to get at what you're suggesting there, for AI to increase the quantity of decisions in a democratic system, if we're talking about the relationship between the voters and the government, it would mean basically having a legislature for plumbing issues, a separate legislature for social issues, a separate legislature for foreign policy issues. And nobody's going to do that. For whatever reason, this the representative democracy norm is incredibly strong. And we pick one person to sort of represent us on a bunch of stuff. And then that person who's the elected representative then then makes decisions that outsources things to a bunch of little bureaucracies and ministries, right? And that's an equilibrium that I don't see changing anytime soon. That, there are a few exceptions to the rule, but nobody's crazy about them. California
mm,
has an insurance commissioner whose job it is to just regulate the insurance industry. And essentially nobody has imitated that, right? So the idea that you have just one person you vote for who makes the insurance decisions, like that has not turned out to be popular. And one can,
mm,
I wrote an essay on this a long time ago, and this was 30 plus years ago, and that story did not happen. That version of more democracy is totally possible, and it doesn't happen. I think part of the reason it doesn't work as an equilibrium at a raw functional level is that we all know that all government decisions are interrelated.
mm,
So, and that's a functional, like almost utopian reason for why, like people aren't doing this because it would be bad is a little bit, it's strange for me to say that as a public choice researcher. Like voters are getting it right, but they are. So I expect that equilibrium to stick. And one question is, will the people inside the government start deciding things on a more discrete, minute level? Would I imagine, for instance, that the number of committees and legislatures would increase. That'd be a more concrete version, a more practical version of the situation you just brought up. There again, the problem is that everything's interrelated, right? And at least in the US, the trait in modern legislatures has been the weakening of committees, like committees and more decisions being made at the legislative level, at the pure legislature level, because there are grand bargains that have to be made across many committees in order to get anything out the door. And so that cross bargaining is something that I know and the weakening of committees is something that's been important in the United States. And without being without knowing about other countries, I assume something like this is happening in other countries as well. That it is a sort of, the aggregation of decisions has strengthened over time. Committees are valued for their expertise on subject matter, but they're not given authority on final votes. They have less authority on final votes than they used to. So committee is still important. So it's a sort of division of labor. What are the benefits of the division of labor versus what are the benefits of cross coalition
centralization
bargaining
of decision?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that centralization is partly about cross coalition bargaining, and cross coalition bargainings seem to be really unavoidable, apparently, and it seems to have strengthened since 1995, since basically the Gingrich Revolution in the U.S. I don't actually have a great story for why that's true. I can tell you a story, right? But not one that I believe in strongly enough to. And my hunch is that AI isn't going to change this very much. The cross coalition bargaining at the aggregate level is probably going to stick with us for a long time. And the AIs may be able to offer suggestions to these politicians about, like, what are some cool angles we could find to bridge the differences across these coalitions. It's a good partner for negotiation. I think that'll help. So I would expect improvements in negotiation quality due to AI. So that's a hopeful piece of news that I think I can offer. Better cross coalition bargains, because you have more people checking out new ideas they wouldn't have thought of on their own because Claude came up with it.
Yeah. I suppose there's a pretty low hanging fruit rationalization for the phenomenon of cross coalition bargaining. But it's probably because we think that that's the happy middle between, when it comes to transitions of power, we think that's probably the happiest middle between bloodshed and dictatorship. Right. So instead of one monarch pass it on to his son, or outright revolution and civil war, we have cross coalition bargaining. And that probably explains its persistence.
Yeah, one thing I often say that one great thing about democracy is that what it is, it's ritualized civil war, right? It's a civil war where we all know which day to show up, and instead of fighting, we just count noses and we decide how we're going to move on, right? And ritualized war is actually really, really excellent, right? And we have social conflict, and to be able to just say, we know there are flaws to this mechanism, but it's a lot better than the alternative. That's part of how we solve things at the broad social level, and it's partly how we solve things within legislatures. In order to count noses accurately, you need to actually have all the noses, right, from the whole legislature, not just one committee.
It's interesting that we're talking about ritualized war, because I think one of the chief sociological functions that ritualized war performs is in disciplining, or at least in performing a public disciplining a spectacle for people to witness. This is a question that I have regarding the disciplining effects of majoritarian rule versus the disciplining effects of the elite or aristocratic class in any one particular society. So the case study here for me, I think a good litmus test is central bank independence, and your arguments about why central bank independence is a great example of why less democracy is sometimes better. Can we say that for some cases in the limit, the opposite is true? Say you have a high inflation country, but because of dollar stable coins, citizens are allowed to exit the national currency without anyone's permission. In this case, we have both democracy, i.e. people voting through their economic actions. And I know this isn't the strict technical term of democracy that you use, but it is like democracy-like. It is democratic in nature. But besides that, it is also a disciplining device against their own government, because if you aren't managing monetary policy well enough or the economy well enough, and our currency is terrible. We want to exit. The economy effectively dollarizes. The government loses control of the entire monetary system. So if this is true, and I might be wrong, my monetary theory is very rusty.
No, this is good.
Since I
Yeah.
never learned it. But yeah, would this be meaningful to you and your view on what kinds of areas should enjoy less democracy if we are talking about how to discipline governments?
Well, here you hit on one of the great ideas of Albert Hirschman, great economist. He wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. He said those are the three ways to try to change organizations, right? And so voice is democracy, loosely. Exit is people just leaving the country or leaving the organization. And being able to use stable coins, say you're a middle income country with a mediocre central bank, mediocre fiscal monetary system, stable coins give you the power of exit, right? And that's different from voice. So I would say that this kind of exit is not democratic. I wouldn't want to use the word democratic for that. I wouldn't say that's migratory. It's voting with your feet, as the other term we use. So if I can just put a question on that, like I'd say, does the rise of stable coins, will it on net strengthen or weaken monetary systems in mediocre countries? And it's a tough
specifically
question.
by way of checking or disciplining against the government.
Yeah. So, basically, does the competition make them better, or does the competition make them worse? This is one version of it, right? I suspect in the real world right now, I suspect it makes them better. That the force of competition, the force of exit, actually will make most central banks in the world, even mediocre ones, better than they used to be, because it's partly because they've all seen this same graph created by Alesina and Summers, Larry Summers and the late Alberto Alesina, who himself was a contributor to deep roots theory and culture transplant theory. And they have this graph showing that countries with more independent central banks tend to have lower inflation, and that it seems to be a free lunch, that you don't seem to have worse recessions when you hand monetary power over to the government. This shows up in all of our intermediate macroeconomics textbooks, our monetary economics textbooks, maybe even a lot of freshman textbooks. And central bankers around the world have learned this lesson and integrated it. So the norms, the idea that with just a little bit, if you have a decently long time horizon, more than beyond, say, 4 or 5 years, that low inflation is really good. That's a really powerful norm. And so any competition that pushes you to pay more attention to that norm, I think actually will pull them in to focusing on low inflation, good monetary systems even more. Now, that's a practical, cultural, historically informed argument. I think it's true right now. In principle, you could say the opposite would happen, right? You could say like, well, if everybody's leaving, then the central bank says, well, what's the point in even trying, right? And so the government might just say, what's the point in trying to run our own monetary policy? Let's just all switch to, using the US dollar. There are, in principle, you could say this could lead to more countries formally dollarizing. I could see a longer time horizon where the rise of stablecoins does lead to dollarization in, say, 4 or 5, maybe even 10 more countries, where they say like, wow, it's really easy to dollarize. And the countries that have dollarized have actually done pretty well. They do tend to be small economies. Panama is totally dollarized, for instance. El Salvador, dollarized. And that is, I'd say both are true. I'll see some more dollarizations as some countries just say, like, what's the point? Stable coins have made it super easy for people in our country to use dollars. And at the same time, it ends up being a disciplinary effect in making monetary policy better in most countries. So I guess the net prediction is the rise of stable coins ends up meaning we get lower inflation globally. Yeah. For both reasons. Yeah, that's a new prediction for me, by the way. I hadn't thought about this until just now, that stablecoins probably lead to more country. It lowers the cost of dollarization. And if you're a smaller country, if you're a big country, different decision. But if your population's less than 20, 30 million, like dollarization is looking better today than it did 10 years ago. Because you're looking around and you're like, even Tether works. And now all the big banks are getting ready to run stablecoins and Stripe's on board, and we all use Stripe. Wow, this dollars start looking better. So
you heard it here first, out of the press. There was a lot of chatter earlier in the heady days of the AI hype cycle. Some chatter about how these two could converge, in that crypto would be the main way that agentic AIs transact in a commercial capacity with one another. Where do you stand on that? And does it change depending on, is it a function of time, or is it, there must be certain conditions under which something like that could play out?
Um, I think like agentic AI wants to trade. I think the agents want to trade with what's most credible. And if they want to engage in high speed trade, like if you're using automated financial, if they're trading stocks at super high velocity, right, they're just going to use whatever software their companies are using, right? And those guys have those super high speed transactions can't be made with cryptocurrency right now. Those are too slow for high speed transactions, right? This is the big problem, a credible problem of cryptocurrency is that basically writing the code to engage in a transaction just takes too long. So despite the AI, despite the crypto hype of like, oh, electronics, computer code is going to be able to be the obvious choice of agentic AI, speed is going to be the first choice of an agentic AI, right?
Mm,
Because they're thinking at the speed of software. And to
mm,
them, Bitcoin transactions are just molasses, right? That's just so slow. It's going to be way too slow for them.
mm,
So the high-speed transaction platforms that are currently being used in the fintech world for trading stocks are going to be what they're going to use for if they're engaging in high-frequency trading, right? For instance, I think that's pretty obvious. That's going to last for a long time. Second, for more mundane transactions, if we're letting AI handle B2B transactions for normal supply chain needs for businesses, those guys are going to be using stable coins because they're worried about, they need stability, right? They want to talk to their bosses and show, yeah, I didn't engage in some high risk transaction that took 5 minutes in which time Bitcoin dropped 3%.
mm.
They know who their bosses are. They don't want to take that risk. I think I do have a hunch. One of my little hunches here is that AIs won't just inherit the normal risk aversion of humans. They'll be loss averse. They'll be loss
Mm.
averse in the Kahneman-Tversky sense of like being kind of strangely worried about small, infrequent losses.
Why?
And because people are, you know, it's the
Mm,
same. One of the classic explanations for the equity premium puzzle, why stocks are in such a huge return, is that people freak out over infrequent, moderate losses to a very strange degree. And so,
mm,
even though stocks have a very high rate of return over the long run, people are still very nervous about holding stocks because, 1 year out of every four, they drop about 20%. And Bitcoin is a very volatile asset, obviously. And I think AIs will inherit a fair amount of our loss aversion, partly because they are born from us and partly because they know they respond to bosses who are
mm,
humans. And so they'll be like, they'll be worried about having to tell their boss, "Oh yeah, I used Bitcoin because it was more efficient and the algorithms are transparent and harder to hack." But one transaction out of every 2,000, I lose 4%. They don't want that on their report card. So
mm.
and so I think that agentic AI will like stable coins when they're doing B2B stuff, and B, crypto is too slow for true high frequency transactions.
All right. Final question. What excites you about the future?
Oh, artificial intelligence. I mean, really, I think this is a huge promise. There are obvious risks, but the possibility of automating research and development is really what excites me about the prospect of AI. That it can move the frontier forward. Chad Jones, Paul Romer, Nobel laureates who invented. Well, Paul's the Nobel laureate who invented endogenous growth theory. Chad's a Stanford professor who just went off to Anthropic on leave. These guys basically built out the theory about how R&D and human economic growth comes from basically R&D research, right? Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's accidental, but one way or the other, we invent new ideas. So far, I think that this is the prospect of getting AIs, artificial intelligences to be supervising, managing R&D labs. That's the prospect that can really double, triple, quintuple annual rates of growth potentially. And, you know, the idea of AI automating this job or that job, those have static efficiency gains. But the idea of getting AIs to run the research and development process, to to automate the craft of learning, that's where we get massive economic growth changes. It'll take time for that to roll out because that's probably an O-ring process with a lot of bottlenecks along the way. But that's where you get the prospect of super fast growth is from integrating AI into the process of expanding knowledge, not just the prospect of automating existing jobs. Yeah, that's the world that gets us 10x richer over every 20, 30 years.
Yeah. What would you say what is the limiting factor for a breakthrough in the economics discipline, maybe insofar as academia goes? And how is it similar or dissimilar to the limiting rates in other disciplines? What would be the technological constraint, if any, for the economics profession that AI could potentially be useful in?
Well, it's worth noting that economics journals have not been hit by a slapocalypse, right? Where like AI generated papers start overwhelming journals. And maybe that's happening at the weakest journals, but the elite journals have not seen like a big increase in submissions, say, of a bunch of obviously AI driven mediocre papers. So the limiting factor so far is basically good ideas. And economists know that like the clever idea, the cool insight, the clever way of addressing cause and effect, that's the limiting factor for us, right? For really great ideas. AI is going to make it easy for us to get access to data sets and whatnot, and for people to double and triple check results. But the limiting factor is good new ideas. And I suspect that this will be something where there's a generational, maybe half generational change. I could say maybe a generation's 5 years now. But basically, you need a new wave of undergraduates and beginning graduate students who are exposed to the AI method of experimentation, of toying around with ideas. When that change happens, that's when we get big payoffs in good economic research, is people who have half a decade of experience toying around with AIs as basically as clever people to talk with, as test beds for new concepts. That's going to really be what speeds things up, is having a wave of people who have flexible minds that'll mostly be young. It'll basically be young people plus Tyler Cowen who are good at taking advantage of this new tool. People with pliable, flexible minds. And that's when we start getting really, really good payoffs. And I really look forward. I hope I live long enough to see all these great new payoffs from these people with pliable minds who are toying around with AI to generate clever new hypotheses.
And with that rallying cry, we've come to the end. Thank you, Garett. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks again for having me. It's been wonderful to be here.